Here is an image of the potassium cyanide caplets that Karl Jaspers and his wife Gertrude kept with themselves in case of arrest by the Nazis. In 1937, Jaspers was retired from his position as a professor of philosophy at the University of Heidelberg. From that point on until the end of the war, he could not teach. In the 1930s, Jaspers had been at the height of his career, having published a 3-volume work, Philosophy, and a detailed study of Nietzsche's thought. But being famous was not enough. On account of Gertrude being Jewish, the Jaspers were at continual risk of being sent to a camp. For that reason, they decided that should they be arrested, they would consume the cyanide and die first. In his 1931 book, Man in the Modern Age, Jaspers criticizes the racial science and eugenics that motivated the National Socialist conspiratorial beliefs. According to such racial science, the human being is perfectible. Human populations are able to be improved through selective reproduction, and the individual can be entirely understood in biological categories and situated on a spectrum between the least fit to the most fit, the least pure to the most pure. For such racial science, there's no room for uncertainty, just the application of an ideal to all individual human beings. In opposition to this so-called science, Jaspers advances his own philosophy of existence. According to this philosophy of existence, the human being is open-ended and free, unable to be fully determined by categories. And though Jaspers worked for many years as a psychiatrist, he criticizes psychologies, anthropologies, and sociologies that try to comprehensively understand the human being and completely understand them in terms of definitive categories. These categories, he says, are ultimately undergirded by a will. For the will decides whether to abide by these categories or to branch out beyond them. Suppose, for example, I consider myself or I'm called an introvert. In this case, my will can decide whether to abide by this category, which is determined through observations and behavior, or to branch out beyond it. In this way, the will is more fundamental than the categorizations of these kinds of disciplines and other reductive pursuits. However, throughout history, these reductive ideologies continue to prop up, and they continue to try to explain human existence in ways that completely remove any mystery to it. Jaspers, in his later writings, came to call these approaches irrational. But what does it mean to be irrational, and what is irrationality? Before looking at Jaspers' view, let's consider 2 views in contemporary philosophy. On the one hand, we have what you might call foundationalism, and on the other, you have what might be called coherentism. According to foundationalism, irrationality arises when we fail to ground our beliefs and other attitudes on specific foundations. These foundations include things like perception, recollection, introspection, and reason. Suppose, for example, I can perceive a maple tree nearby. This would then give me reasons for believing a maple tree is in my vicinity. Suppose I recollect turning off my iron in the morning. In this case, I would have good reasons for believing my iron is turned off. Or suppose I introspect and I can feel myself shivering. In this case, I would then have good grounds for believing that I'm cold. However, suppose I believe that all human beings have wings and can fly unassisted. In this case, the foundationalist would say I'm being irrational because there's no perception, recollection, or introspection that can tell us human beings have wings and can fly unassisted. Now there's coherentism. According to coherentism, irrationality arises when we fail to have consistent attitudes, when our attitudes and other beliefs contradict each other. So consider the case if you believe the world is flat and not flat. The coherentist here would say that you're believing a contradiction because you cannot believe both at the same time that the world be flat and the world be not flat. The 2 things are inconsistent. Jaspers, however, argues that beneath coherentism and foundationalism, there's something deeper. There's a human will. And this will cannot be understood in foundationalist or coherentist terms, but rather it undergirds it. But before looking at Jaspers' view, let's consider some problems with foundationalism and coherentism. First, let's consider the fact that according to foundationalism, our reasons or our evidence, they occur in isolation. A single perception can lead to a belief. A introspection can also lead to a conclusion. However, as W.V.O. Quine, an American philosopher and logician, has pointed out, all of our perceptions and all of our other observations are always accompanied by what he calls auxiliary hypotheses or background beliefs. These are things that accompany our perceptions and observations that are required in order for us to make derivations from them. So consider again my perception of a maple tree. I can't just perceive a maple tree and then draw the conclusion that there's a maple tree nearby. I also have to believe that I'm not having a delusion. I have to believe I'm not looking at a television screen and seeing a maple tree in the television screen. I have to believe that I'm not wearing augmented reality glasses or other kinds of things. In this way, Quine would say that any statement can be held true, come what may, if enough adjustments are made elsewhere in the system. But there are some even further problems with foundationalism. Consider again the belief that human beings have wings and can fly unassisted. Again, you might say this is irrational because we have no evidence for this. There's no evidence that human beings have wings. There's no evidence that human beings can fly unassisted. But then maybe in response to your counter-argument, I say, well, actually, there's a group of invisible aliens which is interfering with our perceptions, such that, no, we cannot see human beings with wings, and we can't see human beings who are flying, but it's because these aliens are intervening. Now, again, you might say this is completely crazy. This is nonsense. It's irrational. However, as Ludwig Wittgenstein, an Austrian philosopher and logician, has pointed out, all of our knowledge, all of our beliefs ultimately come back to foundational presuppositions which cannot themselves be proved. For example, all of us here likely believe that external objects exist. We all likely believe that the universe has existed for more than 15 minutes. But try proving these propositions, and you'll end up in circles. If you try to prove that external objects exist, and you say, well, look, this is an example of an external object, what's the problem? You're engaged in circular reasoning. You're presupposing the external object exists in order to make that argument. Or what if you say, look at the history textbooks. The history textbooks tell us about a world that existed for more than 15 minutes. But the history textbooks are only true if we already believe the world has existed for more than 15 minutes. And so in this way, Wittgenstein says there are these foundational beliefs that if they are different, we can draw radically different conclusions from our perceptions and other kinds of observations. In this way, foundationalism runs into some problems with defining irrationality. There are also some problems with coherentism. Again, consider the claim that the earth is flat and the earth is not flat. You might again say this is a contradiction because the world cannot be flat and not flat at the same time. However, people who seem to be good at believing contradictions often are also good at drawing distinctions that preserve the coherence of their beliefs. So for example, suppose I say, in the first case, the earth being flat refers to the area I'm standing on. For example, the stage. The stage looks flat. I can say the earth is flat. Or if I'm in a field and I say the earth is flat because the field is flat. And in the second case, I say the entire world is round. So in this way, by drawing a distinction between the two meanings of earth, I can preserve coherence in what seems initially to be a contradictory set of beliefs. Or consider this other case, Cotard syndrome. Cotard syndrome is a condition in which one believes oneself to be dead or decaying. One patient who had Cotard syndrome believed she was dead, she believed her bladder was full, and she believed her heart was pumping. Now you might say this is an irrational collection of beliefs, for if you are dead, how can your bladder be full and your heart pumping? However, in response to some questioning, she said the fact that she could feel her heart pumping and her bladder full just proved that people who are dead could have these feelings. At this point, you might be thinking about your own experience, and if you've ever engaged in a conversation with someone you radically disagree with, and you've raised objections to their view, you've likely encountered similar kinds of rationalizations and reasonings. The problem is that the people you're engaging with might have fundamentally different presuppositions. Maybe they draw distinctions in order to preserve the coherence of their beliefs, or maybe you're the one who falls back on speculations in order to undermine the force of challenging reasons. In this way, the irrationality that we're referring to is not an irrationality which is that you do not respond to reasons or that you fail to have coherence. The irrationality, as Jaspers points out, is far more basic. The irrationality here has to do with the will. It's the refusal to consider the possibility of being wrong. Because only through an open will can you accept challenging arguments. Only through an open will can you accept that maybe your views are contradictory or that you're appealing to speculations in order to support an ideology. And this leads us to Jasper's view of reason. For Jaspers, reason refers to the will to communication. Reason names the drive to unity in all that is and all that exists. It tries to bring together the initially dispersed into the unified. However, due to the finite character of human existence, this ultimately proves impossible. And so we can never reach this final unity. We can never reach a final view that no longer needs any kind of revision. And this turns us then to irrationality, because irrationality arises for Jaspers when we believe we've reached this final view, a view that no longer needs modification, that has now achieved complete unity, that no longer needs any kind of supplement, the kind of a view that we see in National Socialism. In light of this tension then between rationality and irrationality, Jaspers calls us to engage in a loving struggle. What is this loving struggle? It occurs between people who are engaged in a dialogue. In this dialogue, without necessarily giving up their convictions, they put forward their own views while receiving the objections of their opponent in a way that's open in both sides. This requires of the participants utter candor. It requires that all forms of power and superiority be eliminated. And it requires as well that those who engage in this conversation be willing to be thrown into question. This contrasts sharply with the National Socialist view. For the National Socialists, they refuse to recognize the humanity of their opponents. They suppress their own vulnerability, and they classified as objects all individuals within a comprehensive system that had no room for doubt. This kind of irrationality hates the free human will. It tries to reduce it to an object, to something other than it is, but it can never fully succeed. So in light of this, and drawing from Jaspers, we must look back to reason. And what does reason require? It requires that we allow ourselves to be open to the possibility of being wrong. It requires that we accept vulnerability without necessarily giving up our convictions. And it also requires that we be willing to learn from others and try to understand the points of view of the people we are conversing with. All these attributes of reason require humility, they require empathy, they require strength. These are all virtues of love. And so, instead of using underhanded tactics to try to neutralize the arguments of our opponents, we should engage instead in a loving struggle with those who pose them. Thank you.